I'm Denis King. Welcome back to Key Changes, a musical memoir, episode 2. Back in 1952, coronation year, most 13-year-old lads happily spent their free time kicking a ball around the street till their mum called them in for tea. Not so much for me and my brothers, however, who found ourselves bouncing a ball around a stage while our mum had a cup of tea. More about that later, but imagine, if you can, being on the road, away from home, for months on end, at that tender age, touring the country in twice-nightly variety, and with no adult chaperone. Horrifying. And boy, did we love it.
We wanna say hello, we wanna see you smile. We're here to entertain you once again.
Mum wrote their signature tune was the eye-catching headline in the October 1952 Briggs Motor Bodies News, a division of the Ford Motor Company. I like to imagine an army of panel beaters downing tools and racing off to get their copy. The previous year, my mother had written to the BBC to try and get an audition for Mike and me, but was told I was too young. After Tony joined the act, she wrote again, and this time we were accepted. Without wishing to give the impression I spend my days scouring the world's press for inaccuracies about the King brothers, I'm obliged to mention here that contrary to every biog or blurb I've ever read on the subject, we did not appear on Hugh Weldon's TV show All Your Own. I never even met the man. Our first appearance on television was in 1952 on Shop Window. This was a live broadcast transmitted from Studio G, Lime Grove, Shepherd's Bush. The purpose of the show was to introduce unknown actors and performers and give them the opportunity of working on camera with established stars. A man named Henry Caldwell produced the show and introduced each act from his revolving chair in the control room with a camera pointed at him, a revolutionary technique at the time. Mum and Dad bought their first television, a 12-inch bulky cabinet model made by Colster Brands, especially to watch our debut. The initials KB on the side of the box happened to match those of the King brothers, something that tickled Dad from the moment it arrived, and he enjoyed pointing out this extraordinary coincidence to anyone who came to marvel at the new acquisition. Shop Window went out on a Monday night at 8 p.m. When our turn came and Henry Caldwell introduced us,
Well now, ladies and gentlemen, here comes music of a different nature.
me perched on a telephone directory because the piano stool wasn't high enough, story of my life, we launched into our rousing opening number, Winifred King's version of I Wanna Say Hello, a popular song at the time.
We wanna say hello, we wanna see you smile. We're here to entertain you once again.
This we followed with Shine on Harvest Moon, and the act ended with me doing an impersonation of Rose Murphy, the Chi-Chi girl, singing her hit, Me and My Sha-Sha Shadow. Which strikes me now as a curious choice, since Rose Murphy was a large black American singer-piano player, and I wasn't, and I'm still not, but the number went over surprisingly well. In 10 years' time, wrote TV critic Peter Black in the Daily Mail the following morning, we may expect to see these boys supporting the American top of the bill at the Palladium, and the youngest, Denis, is a genuine infant phenomenon. At 13, he not only plays and sings with forbidding nonchalance, he smiles as relentlessly as a politician fighting a by-election. An excellent notice, although Peter Black was wrong on 2 counts. The King brothers got to the Palladium supporting American star Howard Keel within 4 years, not 10, and infinitely more important, I was in fact 13 and a quarter, and these things matter at that age. Far more exciting to my father, I imagine, was the headline in that week's Ford News, Sons of Ford Man on TV Show. He and my mother became local celebrities overnight. In those days, anyone who owned a television set, there were 1.4 million TVs in the UK in 1952, would have seen the show because there was only one channel. My parents couldn't leave the house without being congratulated on having such famous sons. Dad acquired new status at work. "Saw your boys on the telly last night, Bill. Bloody marvellous." He loved the sudden attention and lapped up the praise in the machine shop. A pint and a pipe and tinkering under a Ford car might have their moments, but for Dad, nothing beat boasting about his lads to anyone who would listen. My sister Moira was not quite 5 when we first appeared on television. When speaking to her about these memoirs, she told me something that neither my brothers nor I had been aware of. It seems from the moment of her birth, Moira had been Dad's little princess. He doted on her, the shining apple of his eye, and every afternoon when he returned from work, she'd be waiting excitedly at the front gate, rush to greet him, and shriek with delight as he'd swoop her up into his arms. Then came a day, which I regret to say coincides exactly with the King brothers' overnight success, when Moira rushed to the gate to meet Dad, arms outstretched, and he walked straight past her and into the house. She told me that from that moment on he never paid much attention to her, and that for many years she never thought he even liked her very much. I'd had no idea how our success had affected her, none. I just think of her as always laughing and happy and being excited at meeting the famous people we'd bring home, people you normally wouldn't run into in Buckhurst Hill, Sean Connery, for instance. He arrived in a kilt one New Year's Eve, and Tony recalls teasing Moira relentlessly, accusing her of crawling on the floor trying to see what was under the kilt, until she ran off in tears. Bill King, daughter ignorer, decided his 3 boys would benefit from some professional musical tuition, so my brothers and I began travelling into London once a week to the Central School of Dance Music, where Mike had guitar lessons from Ivor Morantz, who ran the school. Tony was taught bass by Joe Medell, a well-known bass player, and my piano teacher was Dennis Wilson, a lovely man who later went on to write the theme for Fawlty Towers. Dad also secured for us a manager of sorts, a Mr. Ron Sensier, somebody he knew from the Ford Motor Company, and it was Ron's job to find us work and advise us on material. Ron Sensier was hardly Ford's answer to Swifty Lazar, given that Ron normally installed head gaskets and wasn't remotely connected to show business, so how we actually got any gigs remains a mystery. But we seemed to be busy. Mostly at weekends, because at 13 and a quarter I was still at school. Tony had left at 15, Mike was then 17 and working part-time for a butcher. As young King brothers, we toured US Air Force bases around the country, Dad driving us in the trusty Ford and sweet-talking his way into every PX for cheap cigarettes. We made another shop window TV appearance, and we performed at numerous local charity concerts. At the Hornchurch and Upminster Theatre Club, for instance, I see here that we not only helped raise funds for their junior group, we also brought welcome relief to an otherwise heavy evening. And at the Gaumont State Cinema, Kilburn, we wholly unintentionally brought comic relief. With over 4,000 seats, the Gaumont State was the biggest cinema in the country. The design was inspired by the Empire State Building in New York. Its fully equipped stage was one of the largest ever built, being 100 feet wide and 50 feet deep, and the orchestra pit was on a hydraulic lift which could be raised to stage level. The producer of the concert had the novel idea of setting the King brothers on this lift, preset in the bowels of the theatre, and as our number began, we would be slowly raised up to normal stage level to perform our act, after which would be lowered back down. It worked perfectly in rehearsal. On the night we were introduced, and down below, on cue, we launched into our song as the lift began its ascent. At which point the lift shuddered and stopped. The top halves of Mike and Tony were in view, but as I was sitting at the piano when things ground to a halt, my head level with the pit rail, All the audience could see of me was from the nose upwards, like one of those cartoon characters looking over a fence. Not knowing what else to do, we carried on playing and singing as if nothing was wrong. The audience started to titter. Below us, all hell was breaking loose. Stagehands shouted and hammered and banged on the mechanism. Titters grew into chuckles, which grew into guffaws, and by the time we reached my piano solo, we were getting more laughs than the comedian who'd preceded us. In the middle of it, there was a sudden lurch, and the lift started to move again. Expectations grew, but not for long. The lift went down, not up. The audience became hysterical. My head gradually disappeared from view. Tony's and Mike's followed, and our final chorus was sung underneath the stage to a bunch of bewildered, head-scratching stagehands. The Gaumont State, for your information, is now a Grade 2 listed building, nothing to do with the disappearing King brothers, and has recently been bought by a church. The Catholic Stage Guild concert in February of 1953 at the Adelphi Theatre in London, and compared by Ted Kavanagh, was, by contrast, technically less eventful but had a much bigger impact on our career. We shared the bill with, in no particular order, Wilfred Pickles, Binny Hale, Nancy and Babe Bridges, two Australian xylophonists, Moira Lister, B.B. Daniels and Ben Lyon, he discovered Marilyn Monroe, Gilbert Harding, whose hand Mike suddenly felt on his backside while waiting in the wings, Eamon Andrews, Jack Cruz, Dame Ninette de Valois and Max Bygraves, all good Catholics, more or less. These three young Catholic entertainers are a mixture of sophistication and boyish ingenuousness, cried the Catholic Times. Bygrave's wife, Blossom, apparently thought so too, and suggested to husband Max that we appear on his forthcoming television show, A Good Idea, Son, which shortly thereafter we did. The show in May of 1953 was broadcast and performed live on a Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. Written by Eric Sykes, it featured, among others, Belita, an American ice skater, someone named Olga-Lita Main, someone else named Lillemor Knudsen, a blonde with very large breasts, the Windmill Girls, and Jean Marsh, whose breasts I don't remember, but she went on to write with Eileen Atkins Upstairs, Downstairs. The show was huge, meaning there was nothing else to watch, and the King Brothers act received quite a bit of attention and publicity. Chesney Allen, of Flanagan and Allen fame, was by then a successful agent, and having seen the show and possibly read our mention in the Sporting Review, "These boys are boogie-woogyists," contacted us to ask if we'd be interested in doing some theatre. And back then, theatre meant only one thing.
Twice nightly, but those lights are burning brightly. If you want to see my act, I'm packed and off to Pontefract twice nightly.
Twice Nightly Variety had its origins in music hall, and by the mid-50s was still one of the most popular forms of entertainment. Practically every town in the country had a variety theatre or two, usually called the Empire or the Palace, and the King Brothers appeared at most of them. The Newcastle Palace, Leicester Palace, Hull Palace, East Ham Palace, Newcastle Empire, Leeds Empire, Liverpool Empire, Glasgow Empire, Finsbury Park Empire. After a while, they all started to look the same. You'd be a week here, a week there, perhaps a week off, then back on the train to somewhere else. You'd play 2 shows a night and a matinee on Saturday, then move on. Sometimes as a whole company, sometimes not. Each act was independent. You might work with, say, Pop, White and Stagger, Half Dancers, Half Crackers, 1 week, and the Apex 4, Sensational Equilibrists, the next, or never run into any of them ever again. Looking at old theatre posters, I see that the King Brothers also worked with a Mr. Bill Kendall, almost a conjurer, Vivian et Passy, Continental Comedy Jugglers, Max Rivers' 6 Winettes, setting the tempo with a perfect swing, and American contortionist Betsy Ross. She bends over backwards to please. None of whom I remember much about, except Betsy liked her gin, and also my brother Mike, who I think was a bit scared of her, particularly when she'd walk around backwards with her head between her legs. But whether you like them or not, all of the speciality acts, every single one of them, the jugglers, the ventriloquists, the escapologists, illusionists, strong men, strong women, acrobats, animal acts, mime acts, magicians, mind readers, were professionals and good at what they did. You might wonder how some of them came up with the idea for their act to begin with, like the man we worked with who hit himself over the head with a tin tray while singing Ghost Riders in the Sky. But you had to at least give them credit for being able to make a living at it. My favourite speciality act was Henri Vadin and his wheel. Monsieur Vadin, who spoke as if he hailed more from Pontefract than from Paris, had a strongman act. Stocky, of medium height, and wearing a moth-eaten leopard skin that was more moth than leopard, and a pair of Roman sandals that crisscrossed up to his knees, Henri began his act with a predictable strongman routine involving the bending of iron bars, the tearing of telephone directories, the breaking of bricks with his bare fists, and so on. But as we discovered the first time we were on the bill with him, there was more to his act than the audience out front would ever know. As Henri approached his grand finale, the music for which we could hear over the tannoy, my brothers and I became aware of a flurry of activity backstage. Dressing room doors opened, conversation stopped, and there was a stampede down the stairs as fellow performers crowded into the wings and jostled for a good view of the stage. Curious, we hurried after them. A drum roll began. Henri produced a Kaiser Wilhelm First World War helmet, the kind with a metal spike on top, and strapped it onto his head. Next to him was an enormous cartwheel, the old wooden kind with an iron rim, and this he lifted up, then heaved, spinning into the air. Immediately he adopted a crouch position. Everyone backstage tensed. When the cartwheel came down, Henri caught it on the spike of his helmet, and upon impact, the force of which would have been enough to flatten a horse, Henri, eyes closed and loud enough for us to hear, but inaudible to the audience, cried out through gritted teeth, "Oh, Christ!" His expression of agony was instantly replaced by a forced and rather sickly smile, as with a triumphant "ta-da" from the band, Henri stood up and received his applause. Nothing quite sums up the bittersweet taste of show business for me as that image. I once related this story to my dear friend, the wonderful writer Jack Rosenthal, who started laughing so much just imagining the poor man having to do this night after night for years on end that he couldn't speak. And from then on, I had only to whisper the name Henri Vadin in Jack's ear at the theatre in the middle of a quiet moment, or when he had a mouthful of fistballs, and that was it, he'd be off. Monsieur Vadin had no idea, I'm sure, of the unmitigated pleasure his act has brought to so many people, or that he would be remembered for so long. Sad to say, the majority of variety acts eventually disappeared without a trace. A few, though, went on to bigger and better things. At the Newcastle Palace, the King brothers shared the bill with two then unknown comedians, Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise. We headlined at the New Theatre Cardiff with an up-and-coming all-round performer named Bruce Forsyth. Val Dunican was a member of the Four Ramblers, an Irish singing group on the bill with us at Middlesbrough. Olivia Newton-John was part of an Australian girl duo we worked with at the Wolverhampton Grand, and at a working men's club in Nelson, Lancashire, we discovered a funny young Liverpool comedian named Jimmy Tarbuck. You just knew you hadn't heard the last of them, that they all had that special something. In 1954, the special something for the King brothers was something called the Bounce and Ball Boogie. This was the brainchild of Mr. Ron Sensia, aforementioned head gasket fitter at Ford's and less than dynamic King brothers manager. And it was, I don't think I'm alone in saying this, a disastrous idea start to finish. The song was made famous by Frankie Sugar Child Robinson. Child, C-H-I-L-E, as in short for child, but incorrectly pronounced chili by Mr. Sensia, who insisted that the number would be a surefire showstopper for the King brothers. It began like this.
You bounce it down low, you bounce it up high, you bounce it in the middle, oh me, oh my, it's the bouncing ball boogie. The bouncing ball boogie. The bouncing ball boogie, I love to bounce it all the time.
And so on. Ron Sansier then brought on board an ageing American choreographer named Quentin Foster, in truth probably no more than 40, and Mr. Foster's inspired contribution to the number was the introduction of a real rubber ball, the idea being that the three of us would sing and play instruments and bounce a ball all at the same time. The ball was red and about the size of a basketball. Mr. Foster had worked out a complicated routine whereby we'd sing a chorus of the song, Sans Ball, itself hidden from view behind Tony's double bass, and at the start of the second chorus, Tony, still playing and singing, would produce the ball and bounce it to me. I, still playing and singing, would bounce it to Mike, and Mike, still playing and singing, would bounce it back to Tony. The ball bouncing would continue for the rest of the chorus, at which point Tony, still playing and singing, would return it to its home behind the bass. It's easy to see why the world at large has never heard of Quentin Foster. Despite limited success at rehearsals, he was convinced it would all be fine. The King brothers arrived off the train at West Hartlepool on a Sunday evening with suitcases, Tony's bass, Mike's guitar, and the ball. I was at the mercy of whatever piano the local theatre provided. It was the start of a 6-week tour. Monday morning was the usual 10 a.m. band call, which is when the acts on the bill present their music to the musical director and the pit band to run through the numbers. It was important to get there early in case one of the other acts happened to be using the same song as you were. Things were on a first-come, first-served basis, and whoever lost out would have to find a replacement song for that week. On this occasion, however, we were quite safe. Curiously, no one else was doing the bouncing ball boogie. We didn't rehearse with the ball for the band call or even mention it to Sid, the musical director, as it was intended to be a big surprise, which it was. Mike and Tony went off to kill time at the cinema after band call, while I, as usual, spent the afternoon sitting at the back of a classroom at the local secondary modern. Being only 14, I was required by law to attend school wherever we were. I can't think that I learned one thing. Often the local accents were so strong I had no idea what anyone was even saying. Being a Londoner, I was a curiosity myself initially, but after the first hour I was usually ignored by everyone, including the teachers. I suppose it was easier to hand me a book and point to a chair at the back than involve me in anything the class had been doing. When the school bell rang at 4 o'clock that day in West Hartlepool, I rushed back to our digs, had a quick cheese sandwich and a cup of tea with my brothers, and we got ourselves over to the Empire Theatre for 5:30. The first show was at 6:15, the second at 8:30. We went to our dressing room, applied our stage makeup, Leishner numbers 5 and 9, changed into shirts and ties and our jackets with the KB on the breast pocket, lovingly sewn on by our mother, Mrs. Winifred King, and made our way to the wings with the ball to await our entrance. When our cue came, we scurried on stage, found our positions which had been marked out earlier, and quickly and quietly set up behind a front cloth while on the other side of it a comedian was finishing his act. As the curtain rose on Britain's youngest rhythm aces, we were primed and ready with our broad fixed smiles in place and red rubber ball discreetly hidden behind Tony's bass. Our first two numbers, Short and Bread and A Sky Blue Shirt and a Rainbow Tie, went swimmingly for a wet Monday night at West Hartlepool with a handful of people in the audience. We were saving the bouncing ball boogie for the grand finale. We began the song,
You bounce it down low, you bounce it up high, you bounce it in the middle, oh me, oh my.
and it went as rehearsed, but then came the second chorus, the ball chorus. In retrospect, I think the crux of the problem, not counting the whole thing being a terrible idea to begin with, was Tony's initial difficulty in retrieving the ball from behind his bass, because by the time he'd got a good grip on it, the song had moved on one bar. This meant any future ball bouncing would occur on the wrong beat. Not the end of the world, but enough to be disconcerting, especially to someone who wasn't that confident to begin with, which included all of us. Tony, undeterred, still playing and singing, attempted to bounce the ball over to me. Unfortunately, it deflected off the side of the piano and made a beeline for Mike. Mike, still playing and singing and wholly unprepared for the sudden change of choreography, somehow managed to strike the ball using the end of his guitar, rather like a cricket bat, and back it shot in my direction. I, still playing and singing, stuck my hand out to grab the ball, but succeeded only in punching it, whereupon it shot straight down into the orchestra pit and hit the musical director on the head. This was the first time Sid had ever seen the ball, and he was not unreasonably surprised. That surprise soon turned to fury, as not only did the ball bounce off his forehead, it then bounced down to knock all his music for the entire evening off its stand and send it flying throughout the orchestra pit. This didn't affect us, musically at least, since we accompanied ourselves, but acts that followed would need a conductor with music in front of him. We watched Sid on his hands and knees frantically gathering up pages of scores as, ballless, we carried on, smiling and singing and playing until the end of our song, after which there was a smattering of applause, most of it, I suspect, based on pity. As we came forward to take our bow, Sid stood up, looking somewhat dishevelled, steaming and clutching a wad of music and the red ball, which he then hurled at us with some force, greatly hastening our exit. I ducked, the ball bounced off Tony's bass and into the audience, never to be seen again. Neither Ron Sensier nor Quentin Foster witnessed the first and last performance of the Bouncing Ball Boogie, staying well out of range in London, and we never saw them again either. At the interval, abject apologies to Sid were required, as well as a significant change of repertoire for the King brothers for the second house that evening.
The Bouncing Ball Boogie, I love to bounce it all the time.
I wouldn't entertain for a second letting my son go off touring in show business at the age of 13, chaperoned only by a 17-year-old, nor would the authorities these days even allow it. But my parents obviously thought nothing of letting their 3 young lads loose around the country for weeks on our own, when most boys of our age had to be home every night by 10 at the latest. Maybe they thought there was safety in numbers. Maybe there was. I just know that after every tour I couldn't wait to get home. Even a week seemed such a long, long time to be away. Theatrical digs, the places you stayed, were not, at least in those days, anywhere you'd want to call home or spend any more time than necessary. You usually arranged them by post prior to arriving in a city, and they looked remarkably similar wherever you were. A small terraced house run by Mrs. Somebody, occasionally a Miss. Only rarely were you aware of a Mr., perhaps a man's voice behind a closed door. Usually 2 or 3 rooms of the house would be let, often to other artists on the bill that week. The room would cost between £4 and £8 per week for the 3 of us, and would include breakfast and an evening meal after the show. I use the word meal in its broadest sense. My brothers and I would share a room that had either 3 narrow single beds or a single and a double. Mike, being the eldest, invariably snared the single. Sheets were thin and often damp. There would be linoleum on the floor, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, a gas fire with a meter by the side of it that took a shilling, 5 pence, and the room was always cold. Hot water for a bath was extra. You could have a lie-in in the morning, but only until 8:30 a.m. Any later, and you sacrificed breakfast, not always a bad thing. Soggy fried bread, runny tin tomatoes with a few baked beans swimming around, undercooked bacon, overcooked fried egg, cold toast and a cup of tea. If ever you came across digs where the landlady cared about the food, it was such a novelty that you talked about it for weeks afterwards. Mrs. Mackay's in Manchester was known in the digs world as the Ritz of the North West. It was clean and warm and dry and had edible, if not memorable, food. If you could get in at Mrs. Mackay's, you were set for the week, although you had to put up with her class system. She'd never admit to it, but a hierarchy existed, with a clear divide being made between actors from the legitimate theatre and those of us from lowly variety. Her digs consisted of 2 interconnecting semi-detached houses which had a common lounge and dining room. The actors were housed in one house, the variety performers in the other, and Mrs. Mackay made it very clear as to which group was the more important. The actors got the hottest tea or toast, the freshest sandwiches, and the undivided attention of a fawning Basil Fawlty-ish landlady. I can still hear her fussing over actor Geoffrey Palmer in the dining room. "Is everything quite to your satisfaction, Mr. Palmer?" she would inquire in an affected accent. Geoffrey was always hugely embarrassed by the attention, sheepishly glancing over to our side of the room where we humble variety folk sat lonely and forgotten, hungrily eyeing any crumbs of toast that had fallen on the floor. When you reported to the stage door of the theatre in whichever city you were playing, the rule of thumb was to tell the stage doorkeeper where you'd be staying for the week, usually digs, but if you were feeling flush, a pub. The stage doorman almost always had a limp and a hearing problem, something that Kenny Earl, part of a comedy double act called Earl and Vaughan, with whom we worked a lot, would invariably put to the test. Whenever he was asked, "Where are you staying this week, Mr. Earl?" Kenny would mumble, "The Cunt and Compass." There would be a pause, during which the rest of us crowded into the dingy entry waiting our turn, tried to keep a straight face. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Earl." Kenny would then reply clearly and distinctly, "At Mrs. Hunter's in Railway Terrace," and the stage doorman, after another pause, would nod and note it down. If you had neglected to arrange accommodation in advance, you'd get a list of local addresses from the stage doorman and make your own arrangements, a practice which still exists today. While doing a week at the Empire Theatre in Nottingham, we hadn't managed to book anywhere to stay and ended up in Desperately Grim Lodgings, a commercial guest house catering mainly for lorry drivers and run by an enormous woman in a stained floral house dress who sang hymns loudly, beginning at approximately 6:30 a.m. Our first morning there, Mike and I were awakened by the strains of "Nearer My God to Thee" coming from somewhere downstairs, and sat bolt upright in time to see a figure wearing a patterned headscarf bending over Tony's bed, an unsavoury-looking character with a ferret-like face, a permanent drip on the end of his nose, and who was in the process of pulling back Tony's covers. "Hey!" we yelled. "What are you doing?" The man jumped, looked around, and shot out of the room. It was later explained that he was a mentally challenged window cleaner. We checked out after breakfast. I recall being only mildly disturbed by the experience, nothing more. I doubt we even mentioned it to our parents. We'd certainly never heard the word paedophile, and no one had even told us to look out for them. Perhaps it was simply a more innocent age, at least on the surface. The first time we were even aware of the existence of homosexuality, though we weren't quite sure what it was when we shared a dressing room with Freddie Hardy in Southport in 1954. A lively, kind little man with a terrible wig who wore makeup in the daytime was how we saw him. Freddie referred to himself as Mother, as in, "Come to Mother, Mother will fix it," and he trotted around making sure everyone was happy and had what they needed. There was nothing predatory about him. You'd think that 3 young, fresh-faced boys might have been an obvious target unchaperoned on the variety circuit, wouldn't you? But other than Mike feeling Gilbert Harding's hand on his backside in the wings, and a well-known and still very much alive choreographer once chasing me around his living room sofa, the King brothers were left alone. Older artists, which almost all of them were, felt protective towards us. They didn't even swear much around us. In fact, didn't swear much at all. Certainly never on stage. Comedy acts might contain the occasional double entendre, but nothing stronger. People would have been shocked. I remember comedian Tommy Cooper at an after-show party at a hotel in Brighton. My parents had come down to see us, and we'd invited them along. Cooper was holding court telling jokes. "Look at this," he said, "an Eskimo having a pee." At which point he opened his flies and out fell a fistful of ice cubes. My dad laughed, but my mother was horrified. At 14, sex wasn't discussed. Definitely not by me, nor my brothers, nor my parents. And despite sharing bedrooms and dressing rooms, we never even saw one another naked. We modestly turned our backs when undressing. Mike had his first romance at the age of 18, a dancer in a summer season, but that too was innocent. Chorus girls were often barely 16, often local, and contrary to what you might think, their morals were generally high. On top of which we were good Catholic boys, at least we were then. When we stayed at a Mrs. Bradley's digs in Leeds, which comedians Mike and Bernie Winters had recommended, saying we'd have an interesting week because it was a very friendly place once you got used to the phone ringing at all hours and high heels clattering on the stairs, it took us a couple of days before we twigged that we were in fact living in a brothel. Not that this changed anything. I think the only physical attention I received there was a fond pat on the head as one of the girls hurried past me upstairs, but it could have been her elbow. Had the young, clean-cut King brothers been discovered living in a brothel, it would have made headlines for sure, but the media was nothing like as intrusive as it is now. That said, if word did get out, whole careers could be ruined by what was then considered immoral behaviour. In 1955 in Morecambe, when comedian Max Wall left his wife and 2 children to take up with a beauty queen, the ensuing scandal finished him overnight. He couldn't get work and eventually had to get a job as a gardener on the island of Jersey. It took until the 1980s for him to be accepted back into the profession, where he eventually re-established himself as not only the wonderful comedian he'd been, but a great actor. And had the press got hold of David Whitfield's quite repellent way of signing his autograph on the bare breasts of underage female fans invited into his dressing room one by one, he wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. I can recall feeling fairly disgusted when I found out what was going on, but it wouldn't have occurred to me or any of us to blow the whistle on him. He was the star of the show. Shameful, but true.
In the next episode, success for the King brothers doesn't always bring the glamour we might have anticipated. What it does mean, however, is some slightly questionable artistes, summer season, quite literally at the end of the pier, and what I could only generously describe as a booking error for a gig on a US Army base in Cold War Germany. See you then. Key Changes is a Brudenus production.